listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast recorded here in Seoul on Thursday, February 7, 2019. I'm joined by Chad O'Carroll to talk about the just-released January month in review produced by NK Pro. But before that, an announcement. Once again, NK News is offering a free year's subscription to one reviewer who reviews our podcast, not only at iTunes, but also at other platforms. And you can save $50 off your NK News subscription by using the code PODCAST at the checkout. Don't forget, if you enjoy the podcast, please share it with others so that our listenership will grow. Okay, I'm joined today by Korea Risk Group founder and managing director Chad O'Carroll to talk about the latest month in review, a product available only to subscribers of NK Pro, the premium NK News package. Welcome, Chad.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Now, this review just came out yesterday and was put together by you and junior analyst Chloe Chu. As usual, you've outdone yourself with this cornucopia of information and analysis. It's 30 pages long, has 7 analytical chapters arranged by theme, plus an executive summary, a wrap-up of notable DPRK state media stories, and a preview of 5 big stories to watch in the month ahead. So much work. How do you put together a comprehensive digest like this every month?
Yeah, it's not particularly easy and it is very time consuming. So we are looking to try and expand staffing soon to get more resources behind this. But yeah, it's about 3 days of solid writing. Wow. And Chloe's been working the month prior, keeping an eye out on all of these different categories of news, collecting stories, and then we cluster them all together and then try and run through them to think about like what the significance is going to be for not just government type folks but also business. What kind of opportunities may arise from things like UNICEF resuming operations in North Korea. Well, it's great if you're a vendor that is connected to the UN system in Northeast Asia, things like that.
Yeah, that's particularly interesting, and may become more so if we have sanctions relief this year.
Right, exactly.
Now, I guess the question that some might ask is there a danger that monthly reviews like this are quickly eclipsed or made out of date by the speed of events?
Yeah, I mean, certainly with career stuff, things just do move so quickly. I mean, it was only January 1 when we were writing the last one and already Kim Jong-un's speech was out. Things do move quickly, but I'd say it's helpful for 2 types of people. One, we get feedback from diplomats that have just come back from vacation. That it's a great way for them to tune into what's been going on. And the other is not really so much now, but in the future, if you're working as an academic or a researcher and you need to get a summary of things that have happened throughout the year, this is a really useful way of doing it because news archives on Google, often articles get removed and some of the detail starts disappearing. So having this will be a good reference for people in future. But yeah, it's not for everyone. But that's why I suggested we could talk about it today so that a few more people could hear about the kinds of things we've been looking at.
Now, given the time restrictions, we're only going to be able to sample a few of the themes that you've gone through in January. So listeners will have to download the full 30-page PDF to enjoy all of it. And of course, before that, they should become subscribers to NK Pro.
Right.
All right. So interestingly, this month began with last month, January, began with one speech by Kim Jong-un and ended with another by U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun. Both were very positive in tone, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. And I think the positivity is something that should be welcomed, of course, but positive in different ways. I mean, if you recall back to January 1, Kim Jong-un was also issuing somewhat of a threat in the sense that he was saying if the US does not become a bit more flexible in its approach, then North Korea may consider alternative options. And it didn't specify what those were, but following stories in December coming out of North Korean media, which had for the first time defined very clearly how they view denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, which was something that would be made for quite depressing reading for anyone interested in a pragmatic solution. I think that the impasse we've had in recent months, frankly, since roughly October, all of these things came together and created some new initiative on the American side to be a bit more flexible and creative, and that led to the two periods of working level talks mid-January in Sweden and Washington, and then Begin Stanford speech on January 31st that you mentioned.
I want to just focus on one major part of Kim Jong-un's speech. This is the renewed focus and emphasis on the economy. And this comes together with, as you mentioned in the month in review, a new propaganda emphasis on economic priorities, growing indicators surrounding potential Chinese private sector interest in the DPRK, as well as the apparent end of a sharp spike in the market value of the US dollar relative to the North Korean won. So what major economic sectors were specified in Kim's speech?
So electrical production capacity was one, which has been mentioned before, but we also saw coal, metals, chemicals, railway sector, machine tools, agriculture. What was interesting is that the light industrial and consumer goods sector was not mentioned at all during the speech, which my colleague Peter Ward pointed out in some analysis.
Right, because it was in previous years, that was always a special focus, because it was the light industry and consumer goods that was supposed to raise the living standards of the people, right? So why do you think it wasn't mentioned?
Well, it wasn't mentioned in the speech, but then it was very visible in some of those stamps and posters which came out. So I wouldn't say it's been forgotten about, but Peter suggested it may be related to the fact that those actors within that sector are becoming more autonomous and self-sufficient and not needing state backing or direction so much, which could well be possible. We've seen such a huge growth in everything from North Korean Frosties and Cocoa Pops and breakfast cereal. Yeah, we've seen North Korean branded breakfast cereals. All these very South Korean style consumer products emerging with very similar packaging.
Have they got flavored toothpaste yet?
Yeah, they have. I know. I remember Jean Lee, actually, the former AP journalist.
Yeah.
I remember she posted a photo of some like carrot flavor toothpaste some time ago. So, I mean, by all accounts, that sector is definitely more prolific than ever before. So maybe those who were involved in Kim Jong-un's speech just felt it didn't need as much of a push.
With all these economic sectors that you've mentioned, it almost seems like, none of these could go very far under the current sanctions regime, could they?
Right.
So it's almost like he's blissfully ignoring or ignorant of sanctions. Just saying, we're going to focus on this, and this, and these are going to be gangbuster years in terms of coal, which is specifically banned, right? Is there some sort of humor in that?
Yeah, it does raise questions. It's almost as well like a hark back to the sort of 1970s, 1980s style North Korea heavy industrial focus, right? And yeah, that doesn't really add up with what we've been seeing in other parts of North Korean propaganda increasingly vividly during the last few years. So it is interesting, and it may be worthy of more study and focus, especially further Kim Jong-un speeches. We should also keep track of where he's gonna be visiting. I know,
right, the on-the-spot guidance.
Yeah, those trips have been rather quiet in the last 6 to 8 weeks. So yeah, it will be worth watching to see where that goes. The electricity stuff, that's always a priority.
Yeah.
It seems they're really, really keen to improve there.
Well, now, also, speaking of electricity, tell us about the interesting new investment proposal that North Korea put up on one of its official websites.
Yeah, so in January we did a story about this on one of the North Korean sites. There was basically an investment opportunity published with a North Korean organization seeking 43 million euros of investment to renovate and modernize the electric power sector. I don't have more details to hand on that specific one, but I can say we've actually noticed a real proliferation of these kind of bids and tenders, and the thing that was really interesting for me, which is not specifically related to the electricity, was one that was posted on a Chinese tender official government tender database website, which was looking for Chinese investors and suppliers who could help build a new highway from Wonsan to Hamhong. So I think when you zoom out and look at this from a bigger picture, it's very interesting that there's a growth of these self-made notifications on North Korean websites, but also seeing them emerge on foreign ones despite all the sanctions is, it may be an indicator of where they're looking to go, which is to try and get mass investment to support a lot of these infrastructure projects off the ground.
If I were to, to put down my spare 43 million euro cash, would I get an equity stake in this North Korean power grid? That would be, and would that be something currently prohibited by United Nations Security Council sanctions?
There would almost certainly be lots and lots of red tape. And in terms of what you get back, well, I just always think about when Mashik Ryong, the ski resort, was being built, we got hold of an investor guide, and it was talking about the projections and the profit share that you'd get. And they were estimating 5,000 tourists a day throughout the year, which is extremely
wishful
thinking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, if there are, I don't know if they're planning tolls. We've started to see this recently in North Korea, toll infrastructure to claim rents from users of the road. But the low number of cars on North Korean highways, you could be in for a very, very long wait to claw back your investment.
It would be all the tour buses, I think, that they'd be getting the tolls from, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Kim didn't just talk the economy up in his New Year's speech. He also talked about it with Chinese President Xi Jinping during his visit to Beijing, didn't he?
Yeah, so when he was in Beijing, he visited a medical factory, and he did talk about the Chinese economic model being the quote-unquote most valuable model to North Korea. He talked about his hopes for more trips to China for study and exchanges.
No, hang on, let me just interrupt. That's interesting because his father, Kim Jong-il, when he was taken on a trip, I think of the Guangdong area there in the southeast, and sort of shown the factory of the world, and said you too can be like this. And I think Kim Jong-il came away very skeptical of the China model. He was never very enthusiastic about it, was he?
Yeah, well, when we had the Singapore summit, I was blown away by the front page coverage on Nodong Shinmun of Singapore, and
Kim doing his walk around.
They referred to like this kind of success story of Singapore, and I remember I decided to compare it with how North Korean media reported on Kim Jong Il's trips to China during the last 2-3 years of his life, and I specifically looked for the terminology around the Chinese socialist economy, and it seemed very very minimal tributary language.
Right.
It was, if I remember, Kim Jong Il showed respect for the Chinese economic model. It was very, very minimal, and it was very low down in the article. Whereas the Singapore thing, it was front and center, and so. Yeah, I do find that interesting. I would point out, though, unlike Singapore, this stuff that I'm referring to is also relatively buried. It wasn't, as far as I could see, front massive central focus of North Korean state media after the visit. So it could just be slightly more fawning, respectful, posture. And that is the type of thing that we've seen Xi Jinping commit to with his promises to go to Pyongyang that only North Korean media ever report on.
Right.
And he's still not done that.
Now, what's happened to the prices of petrol and rice and the value of the US dollar relative to the North Korean won in the last month?
So yeah, on the US dollar thing, Daily NK, which is another South Korea-based North Korea news specialist, they collect data from a range of sources which showed in December a pretty notable peak in the unofficial value of Korean won to the dollar. It went from about 8,000 to 8,500 won in the three cities they're tracking from. And it comes after a lot of stability in that precise indicator. So we were quite startled by this, and in the last month in review did some analysis on it and wondered what might be causing it. But what was odd is that our sources in Pyongyang in January were reporting completely normal rates.
So you mean back to the 8,000 won to the dollar mark?
Yeah, and in fact, they said they never saw a spike. So I did speak to Daily NK about it. Asked like, why do we think there is a difference here? And they suggested that their sources collect these rates from different markets to the ones our ones do. But it raised questions because I was talking to Peter Ward about it and Benjamin Silberstein, and we wondered if that's the case, that you could have two dramatically different rates within one city. It presents lots of opportunities.
Arbitrage.
Right, exactly.
Buy here, sell there.
Yes.
But then eventually, of course, things would even out, wouldn't they, if you did enough of it?
Yeah, you would think so. But what was really odd about the data that we've been seeing, which is from Tongil market, is that actually there's a sign on the kiosk where people can change their cash.
Yeah.
And if you look at the photos I was provided very closely, you can see the handwriting hasn't actually changed at all since at least December. So that suggests a very, very static rate in some pockets of the North Korean economy that don't have any evidence of even microscopic daily changes. So yeah, that was an odd one. We still don't really know what happened there. Then we saw a 13% reduction on the petroleum price.
That's a big drop.
Yeah, that's the price paid by the foreigners living in Pyongyang, the diplomats, the aid workers, and so forth. Interestingly, that came in just after Kim Jong-un's trip to China. I know Benjamin Silberstein on NK Econ Watch is often, I think he recently published some analysis pondering whether those visits have something to do with the subsequent drops we see in gas prices.
Right.
And just on food prices, rice stable, and Daily NK speculating that the stability may be due to Chinese imports.
Which could be a breach of sanctions?
No, food exports aren't sanctioned. It's food exported from North Korea to the outside world that is prohibited.
So taken as a whole, what does all this news about North Korea's economy mean for government and business?
I think on the business side, the thing to watch for is that there's obviously this increase of these tenders and opportunities being posted, and while sanctions are obviously going to get in the way of a lot of those for the moment, there is probability that there'll be some actors who will go for those bids and opportunities regardless of the sanctions and start exploring them on the ground at least, which means ipso facto that some of those opportunities could reduce. And if you care about being involved in the North Korean infrastructure sector, for example, that could be a risk. But I would hazard to guess that the risks of those said opportunities are far greater than missing out on them for now. The other thing for those in the business sector is just the growing rapprochement with China. I really feel from both political and business perspectives is that the indicators are lining up for what should be a very busy year of China DPRK cooperation once again. So that again means that there'll be more Chinese fingerprints on the limited opportunities that do exist in North Korea. We're probably going to see a very, very busy year again for tourism, which has all sorts of potential knock-on effects.
And most tourism is from China, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, we've talked about this before, but last year it really does look like it was possibly one of the busiest years on record for, if not the busiest year on record for Chinese tourism. And, one thing I didn't mention is with the very odd story that cropped up on the Russian embassy of Pyongyang's Facebook page during the last month was that they said that they'd been having meetings with their North Korean partners about how to manage mass tourism, security ministry meetings about like how to securely manage large influxes of tourists.
This is the Russian embassy.
The Russians. So the North Koreans are looking for tips on this from the Russians. And that makes me think that the spikes we saw last year from the Chinese may have been a bit over the top, even for North Korea's abilities to securely, safely manage such a large number of guests. And that they're now proactively looking into it more suggests that, again, there's a belief that this could be a very, very busy year for them on the tourism front. And that leads to, I mean, we have no idea what kind of money that brings the North Korean government. The Chinese pay a different amount to the Westerners, but it's presumably going to be a rather significant figure.
I can imagine, though, that just in terms of numbers, it would surely be still a blip on the radar compared to the number of foreign tourists who went to Pyongyang in 1989 for that 13th World Festival of Youth and Students, for which I still have an open call for people to send in. If anyone out there listening was there in 1989, I'd love to talk to you and to hear your experiences. I'm sure that the North Koreans would have had a difficult time keeping all those young, active students under control during that period.
Yeah, I remember reading a book about, maybe it was a North Korean defector account about life through that period in Pyongyang, and the writer said that when that Expo summit occurred, people started thinking, wow, the country's really changing and, you know, there's a new future ahead. And then like a week or two later and they're all gone. Things obviously went back to normal. Just for listeners, I know we're sort of swinging away from the main topic at hand, but I really recommend going on YouTube and looking up some of the videos of this 1989 Expo. It's, you know, just foreigners en masse roaming around Pyongyang, and it's really pretty remarkable stuff.
It's the Pyongyang 13th World Festival of Youth and Students, or something like that.
To compete with the 88 Seoul Olympic Games, right?
Right. For which they built that giant triangular Ryugyong hotel.
Yes, yeah.
Now let's talk about the speech that ended the month of January, the Stephen Biegun speech at Stanford. There's so much to talk about here. Where do you want to begin, Chad?
Well, I think the speech is important for the fact that it's really laid out a roadmap approach for the first time since the Trump administration took office. You know, in late 2017, especially early 2018, we were hearing all this talk about the need to very urgently resolve this situation. And I remember just before John Bolton took office, during one of his last interviews with Fox, he said something along the lines of, when asked about the purpose of Summitry with Kim Jong-un, he said, it's great, so we can ask him which ports to dock in next week so as we can load your nuclear program and ship it back to America. Yeah. Obviously, that hasn't happened. And the maximalist position of all or nothing position of no sanctions relief until full denuclearization very clearly now seems to be shifting. And Biegun's speech on January 31st, I think, was a really crystal clear articulation of this.
This is after his because he had that trip to Stockholm to meet with some working level North Koreans in Sweden, right? And also some South Koreans were present. So in the wake of that, he makes this big speech and he lays out some very, very specific things, doesn't he? Yeah.
And we can talk about some of those. I mean, it's very, you know, it starts out with the preliminary steps, quote unquote, of North Korea actually fulfilling this pledge to destroy the Tongchanri missile site. We know that's still pending. It's only kind of been half done. Then there's talk of allowing American experts to see the destruction of the Punggye-ri facility, which about 30 journalists got to see last year, but that was it, despite previous North Korean pledges to allow foreign experts. Then it goes on to North Korea's pledge to destroy the plutonium and uranium stuff at Yongbyon.
Yongbyon and beyond, right?
Yeah, Yongbyon and beyond.
Yeah.
Next steps on DPRK plutonium. It goes on and on. One thing, though, it does, we thought it was lacking, is any real mention of what the US might be able to do as corresponding measures to push these things along. And yet, Biegun, in his remarks, did tacitly concede that there does need to be American corresponding measures, and he says that those have yet to be agreed with the North Korean side. But I think it was for pragmatists a good speech because it laid out a realization that there does need to be a step-by-step process. This is a pipe dream to imagine to compel North Korea can be compelled to just roll over and give everything up in one go.
Well, and in fact, Began did spell out that pipe dream, didn't he? In his speech, he said, "I have this perfect outcome moment where the last nuclear weapon leaves North Korea, the sanctions are lifted, the flag goes up in the embassy, and the treaty is signed in the same hour." But he realized in the very next sentence, he realized that that's the ideal world, and practicalities don't always work that way, and it's going to have to be phased, and that phasing, that's what we don't know about it, is will it be sanctions relief? Will there be a halt of spring exercises? Because that'll be coming up very soon. What will be the incentivization?
I think we're going to start hearing a lot about sanctions relief with these kind of snapback mechanisms where there's like a 6-month window of relief offered, say, for example, for the KCNA industrial complex. And the Security Council would then proactively have to decide to extend that 6 months later with a vote of unity, I would imagine, of some sort, for it to continue. And that seems to me a prudent option. I've seen a lot of conservative criticism of the idea of sanctions relief. Once you relieve sanctions, they can't ever be put back. Well,
they can if you have a snack back.
Exactly. So I think that would be an interesting area. And if sanctions relief really is meaningful for North Korea, it could actually compel, ongoing good behavior. So that's one area to watch. And another will be, this humanitarian assistance thing. We've seen Began spearhead since December this kind of new American approach, since it only lasted 2 or 3 months, when in October the US reevaluated its posture on humanitarian assistance.
Right. Began talked about, he said specifically that they're clearing a backlog of approvals that had accumulated at the United Nations Sanctions Review Committee. So these are aid organizations and relief organizations looking for exemptions so that they can continue providing aid to North Korea.
Yeah, so I think look for more of that, and possibly there might be some US interest in much broader support for humanitarian stuff. Just remember, the South Koreans currently have about $8 million of aid pledged to the UN system, which dates back to late 2017, amid the maximum pressure period. And we've heard from sources that in the US that the government there is really quite opposed to South Korea implementing this assistance to the UN system at the moment.
Why would that be?
Consider we've recently had South Korea unable to deliver Tamiflu medicine. And my understanding is this is due to some initial logistics concerns from the American and UN command side that have since disappeared, but the issue remains unresolved because the North Koreans and the South Koreans have yet to agree a date to allow this delivery to take place. But the point being is there is a pretty hardline view still, I think, among large parts of the American administration regarding inter-Korean activities in general, and even on humanitarian, because there's the logic. And this is even manifested in public statements by senior officials. Why can't North Korea pay for its own humanitarian? That, for example, Rolls-Royce that Kim Jong-un recently got $450,000. South Korea, just some NGOs recently pledged about that amount in rice or humanitarian aid. Aidan Foster Carter pointed this out yesterday.
Right.
So there is still that question mark about why foreign assistance is needed. But
what about U.S. troops in Korea? Was that mentioned by Began at all as a possible carrot to North Korea, removal of U.S. troops or downgrading of the size of U.S. forces?
No, I think that was excluded. Began said that those weren't on the table right now. but it was a point interesting that he covered, because there has been growing concern among some that the Trump administration could be looking to withdraw troops.
All or some, because of the cost-sharing dispute that's been taking place between the two militaries of South Korea and the US. Because we've got an election year next year where it would be, could be a good cosmetic look for Trump's electorate, his constituents rather, to be bringing back troops, showing that South Korea is not paying enough. But yeah, Began seemed to be saying that that's not something that's on the cards right now. After the visit by Kim Jong-un to Beijing, there was this visit by an artistic troupe to Beijing, wasn't there? There was, and the foreign minister, Ri Su-yong, led this delegation of North Korean artists and musicians. Xi Jinping went to the concert. There were warm words and things. This is a far cry from December 2015, when the Moranbong band suddenly cancelled their concert.
And it's a far cry from even late 2017, when we were witnessing open warfare between the Global Times of China and KCNA of North Korea, the two publications really going at each other for perceived slights in the way that the administrations were handling relations between the two countries. Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, Xi Jinping has had a lot of time for North Korea recently. Ri Su-yong was there in December, and a foreign ministry delegation there in December. He's met Kim Jong-un in January, and then he's going to a concert just 2 or 3 weeks later.
Right.
So yeah, it's a big shift. And we saw South China Morning Post reporting that, I found this very interesting, that there could be a Xi Jinping visit to Vietnam at the end of February to meet with Trump. Before the Singapore summit, there was a lot of speculation that Xi and Moon may come for the day 2 type of activities, which could have consequence for peace treaties and so forth. But yeah, interesting. But just going back to the concert, yeah, you probably saw those great photos of Kim Jong-un in a room with maybe couple dozen female performers, giving them a sort of briefing about giving his on-the-spot guidance.
Oh yes,
it's evidence that the North Koreans want to show they're sending their best.
Yeah. Now, last year, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited in early May, and Li Shanzhu, the current chairman of the Standing Committee for the National People's Congress, visited in September for the 70th birthday celebration. So, a sign of this stepping up of Chinese DPRK relations. You mentioned just before that Xi Jinping has once again accepted an invitation to visit Pyongyang, but this is only covered in North Korean media, not in Chinese state media. Do you think do you see him actually visiting Pyongyang this year?
I think he will. It's just a case of the circumstances being right. Maybe last September it was a bit unfortunate because the Singapore process had really bogged down. There wasn't a great relationship at that time between the US and DPRK. So there may have been some hesitation. But yeah, I don't see why it can't happen. Hu Jintao went in 2005, I think, to Pyongyang. So there's relatively recent precedents. And in terms of dates, we've got April 15th coming up again, the big annual celebration in North Korea.
I do wonder whether Russia and Japan feel left out at this point.
We heard last year of Kim Jong-un accepting a invitation to visit Russia and meet with Vladimir Putin, and that kind of all went quiet. But a Russian journalist did ask about this in January, and it was said that the visit is still on the cards. They're just working out dates and so forth. And in terms of Japan, in the last month, we also saw Shinzo Abe talking once again about his interest in having a summit, which I find with the Japanese, he said he wants to act resolutely, never failing to seize every opportunity to break the shell of mutual distrust, to directly face Chairman Kim Jong-un. That's an English translation, but it doesn't sound like the most warm kind of wording or expression of interest in meeting, because he wants to look firm to his domestic audience. He wants to be resolute in solving the abduction issue and probably a litany of other bilateral problems between the two countries. And
it's funny that this is happening simultaneously with his difficulties with South Korea in the month of January, right? These low-flying aircraft over South Korean naval vessels and arguments about radar painting and all sorts of things. I mean, there's a shell of distrust right there between Japan and South Korea.
There's a big one, and I do think it's interesting that Japan is, really more and more regularly talking about interest in summits. I think they probably are the odd ones out. If you look at the bigger picture, the Japanese have been consistent in the last 2 years of still being very doubtful about this whole process, continuing to release photos of ship-to-ship transfers in North Korean sanctions breaches, etc. But at the same time, Shinzo Abe in the last couple of months, especially, more and more of these statements interested in meeting with Kim. So, we'll see. The problem for the North Koreans is for Shinzo Abe is if the North Koreans will want a reparation payment discussion for the colonial period, which is still unresolved. South Korea got this payment, North never did, probably as a condition. And the Japanese, in contrast, want the abduction issue, which for the North Koreans seems to be impossible to resolve at this stage. So where do you start?
I know. Now, since we're running out of time, let's talk about the months ahead. What are some of the primary issues that you think will dominate the North Korea news cycle for the month of February?
Well, we were already seeing the first one, the Vietnam summit. Yesterday, details were released on that. So that's the first thing. Second thing will be, is Kim Jong-un going to do the party-to-party summit in Hanoi before that? It'd be a bit disrespectful to go to Vietnam and ignore your socialist brother. Do you
know where the summit will be held yet?
No, it's still
what are the options?
Question mark between Da Nang, the beach coastal resort, and Hanoi. And we've heard from sources that the North Koreans want Hanoi, the Americans are more inclined for Da Nang, and I heard last night that it's actually the Vietnamese that want Da Nang, maybe because it's a more attractive spot to promote to the international community.
I'm just thinking also, is Da Nang maybe an easier place to handle security and logistics?
A lot of people have said that. I was in Hanoi in October or November, and it certainly was chaotic. So I can imagine security would be quite hard there. Another thing I think we're going to see in the month ahead is, on the one hand, continued reticence from the US, from other parts of the P5 on sanctions pressure. New designations, of course, and no way they're going to occur in the run-up to a summit. But interestingly, the UN panel of experts, its annual report on North Korea is now been submitted to the Security Council. It's over 300 pages long, a long list of sanctions breaches, violations, and so forth, and that's already starting to leak into media. So that's kind of going against the grain of this this sort of rapprochement and the lack of pressure I think we'll see on the sanctions front. But I guess a lot of that's mainly tactical level stuff from the North Korean perspective. So it's probably not going to, and it's systematic and annual in frequency. So it's probably not going to rock the boat too much from the North Korean perspective.
Will South Korea finally get the Tamiflu through to North Korea?
I have a feeling this one could fall through the cracks because by the end of February, peak influenza season is going to be past, and in some ways, it's more prudent for the North Koreans to prevent this being delivered. They know that Moon really wants this inter-Korean rapprochement, and he needs strong momentum and regular exchange. Now, if there's been any kind of issue with sanctions compliance that initially prevented this taking place when South Korea pledged it would take place, there's a good argument for North Korea to use that and say to Seoul, look, you know, we don't need it anymore. We don't want this. You guys need to figure out how to deal with sanctions compliance before making these offers in future, because this is an area that should be exempt. And if we're getting stuck in the weeds of cargo trucks being against sanctions that roll in and roll out back to South Korea, so then I think it would be a tactical. It makes sense for the North Koreans to just play a bit hardball on this. And,
good leverage.
Yeah, and just say, look, we're not willing to engage with you until you sort yourself out a bit and get a bit more clarity on when we can move things in and out. And you know, it's interesting because in January we also saw a much lower number of inter-Korean exchanges outside of the core Kaesong liaison office. So while in December we had loads of military to military stuff, we had all the railroad stuff. Since that railroad groundbreaking ceremony, we've seen nothing in terms of activation of the project, steps to take it forward. I think there's one meeting only at the end of January. So yeah, and we know North Korea is upset with these sanctions hurdles. So maybe if they decide to put the brakes on some of these things, then it can put more pressure on South Korea to find solutions.
Now, I have to mention that today, February 7th, is the 5th anniversary of the UN's Commission of Inquiry's report into human rights abuse in North Korea being released publicly. Human rights was noticeably absent from Stephen Begin's speech in Stanford. He did talk about some humanitarian aid, but he didn't. He said something about we, meaning North Korea and the United States, we have different ideas about human rights. That's pretty much all he said about human rights. Do we imagine that coming back up? Would it be mentioned in the summit in February, or would it be somewhere else in the media?
Well, I think Trump is going to be under some pressure from American North Korea watchers, if he cares in any way about that cohort or community rather, to raise human rights. And I actually, there's some people say you can't raise human rights and have diplomacy with North Korea. I don't see why you can't raise human rights that North Korea prioritize and have diplomacy with North Korea, i.e. let's have robust discussions on right to education, women's rights, right to food, blah, blah. There's a whole pool of human rights that countries like China and North Korea strongly seem to back. They just happen to disagree with the West on the importance of things like freedom of political thought and access to media, etc. But the US could bake into the next summit some effort to talk about that kind of low-hanging fruit, that North Korea is on the same page, and then you see how that discussion goes and go from there. Now,
tomorrow, February 8th, is Army Building Day. Do you expect to see a major military parade, which we had last year?
No way.
That seems off the cards, doesn't it?
It does.
That would be a surprise. I mean, if they turned up with a big parade tomorrow, that would be a surprise.
It would be a huge surprise. Hwasong 15s rolling through Kim Il-sung Square.
Right, and those men with the radioactive backpacks, you know the ones?
There would be one way to mix it up and keep everybody guessing. But yeah, I don't think we'll see that tomorrow. It's just going to be a normal day in Pyongyang.
Now, lastly, do you want to leave us with an interesting story that appeared in North Korean state media in January that people might have missed?
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to the human rights thing. There is a report in the Nodong Shinmun on January 8th about a newly built welfare facility for the disabled in North Pyongyang province. Apparently, the new facility will help facilitate implementation of the state's policy towards disabled persons. I mention it because these are the kind of stories that really get overlooked a lot. And
that's one area after the Commission of Inquiry report that North Korea said, okay, we're going to work on this, the rights of the disabled, didn't they?
They did, and we've acquired photos from Pyongyang, even showing disabled persons roaming around the streets in those kind of electric buggy things. And you think before the Commission of Inquiry, there was all those stereotype stories that that all disabled people are banished to the country and so forth. But there seems to be an effort to embrace that area of recommendation, and again, no one will really draw attention to those stories unless we zoom in on them like this because they don't get, even in the North Korean state media, they don't get a lot of priority there either. But
where's this new facility being built?
Northern Pyongan Yeomju-gun.
Okay, so that does kind of conform a little bit to the stereotype of handicapped people being banished to the provinces, right? I mean, that's nowhere near Pyongyang.
That's right. It's nowhere near Pyongyang, but I would, and I'm just going to hazard a guess here, I would dare say we could find stories about similar facilities in Pyongyang. But yeah, it's just, another interesting indicator that the North does listen when it comes to some of these concerns. And for all the bashing on human rights, I think there should, it is important that these kind of emerging trends can be encouraged at the same time.
Well, thanks again, Chad, for coming in for the monthly review. Again, as I said, there was so much in this review, we're only barely able to scrape the surface. And I encourage all listeners to get onto NK Pro and download the entire month in review, the 30-page PDF file, print it out and go through it, or have your institution sign up and become a member so you can get it through them. Don't forget, you can listen to all of our shows as well as read full bios and show notes on your website at nknews.org. NK News is the leading repository of North Korean research, news and analysis, and we hope to see you there. And you can send feedback, comments, questions, or guest suggestions to podcast@nknews.org. Our podcast was produced, as always, by Arius Dare and facilitated by Chad O'Carroll, the man himself, and Christina Lee. And lastly, a reminder that one random reviewer per week will win a free NK News membership, so please review us after listening and you might win. And please do share this with your friends and followers and enemies so that we can get more listeners every week. Thanks again, and listen again next time.